Hello everyone, welcome to another one of our Through the Bible studies, not in which we'll be going verse by verse, but point by point, event by event, through the book as a whole to give you a general overview of what the book is about. This isn't to be an alternative to personal Bible study, but rather salting the horse, so to speak, giving you the opportunity to look into further things and reasons, to remember where was that in Scripture, or familiarize yourself with Scripture so you have reason to want to know more about the details we're going to discuss. Now, I naturally, before going into the book at all, want to give you the historical background to the book so we not only know why we're reading, but what we're reading in the first place. So, starting with the who wrote this book, who was the author of Ruth? Well, none have been directly claimed because these are historical narratives and they don't title them in the same way as they did in the 10th century BC. But the possibility would most likely be associated with the prophet Samuel, and yes, the author who was associated with 1st and 2nd Samuel. He was a prophet of God, he was the last judge, he was an individual whose life not only included miracles, but was also most significantly responsible for crowning Israel's first two kings. He didn't really have a reason to lie about this, but because of his association with the greatest king Israel's known, second to Jesus, but that will be forthcoming. But in David, Ruth is essentially a background of his family history and something that he would have had direct access to and want to preserve in order to give the nation an idea of what ultimately this king was coming out of or where this king was coming from. And we know this actually is a historical narrative, not just because it's advertised as such, but it also gives us a certain amount of immodesty, for lack of a better word, on the more grisly details that were happening in this day and age. This book takes place, it was written during the 10th century BC, but it was actually written some time before it, almost a century, some believe, before the time of David, because it discusses the family records of his great-grandparents. And what was interesting about this as well was it includes details that we would call accounts of embarrassment. It includes details that are directly associated with the law of God. It discusses cultural references that would apply to this time period. And these are all things that we'd look to in something not only as history, but as reliable history, because they wouldn't mention embarrassing details, like, for example, that Ruth was a Moabite and directly related to one of Israel's kings. That would have been fuel for the fake news articles, so to speak, except it'd be true, it'd just be outright embarrassing. But there'd also be other accounts that would be directly associated with this time. It wouldn't be saying, or rather making mistakes of saying that, oh, back then they still had the things we were doing today. That would be the equivalent of a blunder of doing a remake of D-Day, but then showing B-52 bombers strafing the beach. They didn't have those kinds of planes back in that day. So to quote apologists on that matter, that's why we would trust Ruth as history. Where did this take place? Two areas in the Middle East. First would be in modern-day Israel, specifically the city of Bethlehem, which is a few miles south of the capital, the current capital, the city of Jerusalem. And as well as Bethlehem, it also took place in a city that was in the country of Moab. Now, that doesn't have a designation today, but it would be closely associated with the modern-day country of Jordan. So those are the two places geographically where this book took place. Why was this book written? Well, once again, as mentioned, it was to show a record of God's involvement in the family of the Messiah before it had even been established in David. So these records would have had some value in that, as not only keeping track of David's family history, as every single Jew would want to keep track of their ancestral line, the genealogies as they were called, but also, even more importantly, since David was the one who was given the promise that through you, the Messiah is going to come, that God's going to enter this world through your family bloodline. Well, that'd probably make you wonder, was this the first time God's interacted with the family of David specifically? Well, no, that actually wouldn't be the case. In fact, we could go all the way back to Judah and know that that wasn't the case, but this is just reinforcing that theme. Now, how was this book written? Well, since we know that Samuel would have had personal interactions with David's family, who directly witnessed this story of their family, we would know this is a historically reliable account. As far as who wrote it and when, understand the emphasis is on the details, on real people and real events and things that we can confirm archaeologically. So the semantics as far as a name to the book is not going to be the number one issue. It is an issue, but because of all the extra information we have, it's muddled off to the side as saying, okay, well, we at least know this is real. So, starting the book, first event, and where we start off, a man named Elimelech, who was the father of this household, not exactly the most godly, but it's nonetheless a significant name because during this time in history, around the 11th century, some would even say during the time of the judge named Samson, you guys would know all about him. Historically, this was not a time where Israel was collectively following God, and for lack of a better term, was also dealing with some serious issues. But this man named Elimelech, who came from a godly family, and we could recognize that not only just based on later conduct, but also in the name that he had himself. They didn't name babies for just any old reason. Elimelech was named in association with something that not only reflected his personality or something that was taking place historically during his birth, but they would even name babies as a time of dedication to God, at least when they were following God. So Elimelech, whose name literally meant, "My God is King," he would be a living sermon. His parents gave birth to a baby and said, we're going to use this child as a living witness to the fact that God is King. Elimelech. Melech is king. So we're talking about this and just saying that this would be an example of a godly home. Maybe not a godly person, per se. We can't confirm that yet. But what we know about his name speaks volumes. Naomi, whose name meant pleasant, was married to Elimelech, and they had 2 sons, whose names were also telling. The first one was named Mahlon, which is a term that you would describe someone who's sick. I guess when he was born, they had few other words to describe him. And Chilion. Chilion was even less flattering because it means tiny. And not in tiny as in just like from a vantage point or perspective. It would be like someone who's just shriveling up and waiting to die. So not the strapping, strong young men volunteering for football and all that stuff born into this family. So you have My God is King, married to Pleasant, and their 2 kids, sick and tiny. So anyway, their home was in Bethlehem. Ironically, that word means house of bread, and they were short of bread during the time of this famine. So they decided to move to Moab. Now, for those of you who remember the law, not 4 books back, you would remember that that was not something that Israel was to do. They were given this land to be sustained in this land, to be provided for in this land, and they weren't to have anything to do with the nations around them for obvious reasons, and most specifically what they were doing in those lands and nations. They were supposed to be an example to the world of what a relationship with the true and living God looks like, while they were off just basically worshiping justifications for bad habits. That was the extent of what idolatry was. But by going to Moab, they were not only going where God didn't tell them to go, but on top of that, they were going into the land of someone God specifically said were cursed from Israel. And there's historical reasons for that. If you remember in the book of Numbers, an ancient king of Moab, whose name was Balak, he didn't look into his family history and find out that the people of Israel are related to him through their ancestor Lot. Lot had 2 sons. I won't tell you how. You can ask in the comments. I'll reiterate that gross point. But Lot had 2 sons who were named Moab and Amnon, or basically just founded those nations. Their names were different, but it's taken beside the point. These 2 countries were ultimately the descendants of them, and Lot was a nephew of Abraham, who was the progenitor of Isaac, who was born to Jacob, who was born the 12 tribes of Israel, and they're the ones that make up the nation today. Well, you're looking at all this and saying, why would they go into the land of their enemies? Why were they becoming enemies in the first place? Well, the reason why they were cursed by God is, what I was getting to. He didn't look into his family history and say, oh, well, we're relatives. Obviously, they're no threat to us. No, all they saw was that the Canaanites were being judged by God for 400 years of ignoring their second chances, and now we're facing judgment after rejecting mercy. Always in that order, by the way. And they figured that they were next. Sihon, Og, Balak's next. Oh no, we have to preemptively attack. Not the wise decision. He hired a prophet of the true and living God, by the way, whose name was Balaam. And Balaam was basically the televangelist of his day. He loved money and getting paid for his work rather than doing the work and doing it right and of itself. He tried to curse God, even though God came to him quite dramatically and told him not to do that. Whenever he tried to spit out a curse, it was like Jim Carrey and Liar Liar. Only blessings came out. Balak, when old Donald Trump had said, "You're fired," and Balaam, wanting the money, said, "No, just hear me out. I can't curse them. Their God's protecting them, but I can get their God to curse them. Here's what you do. You got all those girls, right? When the moment that they turn 12 or 13, the moment they hit puberty, you throw them into prostitution in order to worship your pagan god Ashtoreth." And they go, "Yeah. Okay, well, here's what you do. You send the girls into the camp, the more mature ones, the ones that'll get the boys excited, and when they let the relationship progress and do the thing that prostitutes do, they may not know better, but their people will. And they'll just be acting on base urges. God will strike them dead, and he'll be doing your work for you." And Balak was going, "Yeah, I like this plan." So he did, and 25,000 people ended up being struck dead for the choices they made. Now catch this as well. They had made those choices. God held them personally responsible. 25,000 people dead. But who was responsible for setting this up? Where was the smoking gun really hiding? Who was the fingerprint behind the one who actually handed the weapon off that would inevitably explode in their face? Well, that was Balak. And God held him directly responsible. He said, "Because of what you have done to my people, 25,000 people are dead because of you. Not only are you going to be judged when you weren't going to be originally, but now your family is accursed from me. And everyone who's born into your nation, they're separated from God. They're not going to be welcome with my people anymore. They are now enemies of God, just like the Canaanites, who have rejected 400 plus years of second chances." So, living under that bad sign, the Moabites have been keeping their distance from Israel. Or not. They should have been. King Elgon learned the hard way. But that goes into the book of Judges. Now, Israel is in a place where they're kind of turning to people that they shouldn't. And this family, who is supposed to be a godly family, just settled down in Moab. And they decide to settle down so long that the boys, sick and tiny, ended up getting married. Ironically enough, the girls that they married were named Orpah, whose name means athletic. She was the gymnast type. And Ruth was the second Moabite girl that was married into this supposedly godly family. And Ruth's name literally meant beautiful. So the only thing that Ruth and Orpah's parents thought of when they saw their baby girls was, "Oh my goodness, you are going to be on the track team. And oh my goodness, the boys are going to be chasing you." So, beautiful and athletic, married sick and tiny. And this is what they did while they were there. They essentially just got used to living in a place where God didn't tell them to go. Now, note, this was serious. And essentially, it was their decisions that ultimately led to what happens next. And that brings us to event number 2. Naomi returns to Bethlehem. Now note, I'm referencing Naomi first and not Elimelech, because Elimelech, as well as sick and tiny, Chilion, and Mahlon, all died. We aren't told how or why, just natural causes. But while they were in this place, essentially you got 3 girls, Naomi, Ruth, and Orpah, who are now all widows. And because this society isn't founded on Christianity, no one's really going to be extending hands of kindness unless you're in a place where your God actually cares for those people. And by the way, Israel was exclusive in that regard. But what was also interesting about this was Naomi knew that no one was to blame for the situation but her. She's the one who went to this country. She's the one who left her home in Bethlehem. She didn't even know if she had a home to go back to because the land was essentially being taken over every 10 to 15 years by another warlord because Israel wouldn't grasp the concept of follow God, you have peace, reject God, you'll have war. But she decides, you know what? There's nothing for me here. Your nation, your leaders, your quote-unquote gods, they don't care about me or the state that we're in. Girls, you're still young. You can find good Moabite husbands. This was just a bad situation. I'm going home. You can stay here. Now, Orpah decides to leave, and she cries with her mother-in-law and then just decides to move on with her life. But very interestingly, Ruth decides to stay. And I want to read to you Ruth chapter 1, verses 16 through 17, because it might sound familiar to some of you. Entreat me not to leave you, or to turn back from following after you. For wherever you go, I will go. Wherever you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. The Lord do so to me, and more so, catch this, if anything but death parts you from me. So literally this commitment, the origin of the statement, till death do you part, comes from Ruth, who was the daughter-in-law to Naomi, and they were speaking in the context of friendship. Make a note of that. Now, the third event, Naomi returns home. However, Pleasant decides that that would just be too ironic a statement given the kind of personality that her recent life experiences had left her with, and decides to change her name to Mary, which means bitterness. And this bitter person returns home and essentially just grieves the loss of her family with Ruth. She doesn't want to leave and take advantage of the things that God has put in his law, requiring the people of God to care for those who are less fortunate, to leave the corners of your field unharvested so that anyone who's homeless, down on their luck, or the orphan and widow who wouldn't be able to work, they would be able to go and gather food from their field to support themselves. Note they couldn't, carry bundles off and just live off of you, but they would be able to be provided for in their meals. Now, Mary wasn't willing to do this, but Ruth decided to take the advantage. She went to the field of a man who was still honoring God during this time period, not just in name, but in character. And his name was Boaz. Now, this was interesting because this encounter ultimately what turns this historical document into a romance novel, except it's nonfiction. When Ruth is working in this field, Boaz catches sight of her. Now, once again, I emphasize, he wasn't just godly in name, but he was also godly in character. And he was a godly man who even went out of his way to bless his workers in the name of the Lord. He'd go out of his way to treat people who served under him, who were gathering in his fields, well. But then when he goes to the sections and he says, now remember, God's law says to leave that for the orphan and the widow. He catches one widow gathering in the field and he's like, ooh, her name's probably not beautiful, but she sure is beautiful. It was. But all these things are happening. And he's just like, oh my goodness, that is someone that I want to bless. Catch that. I want to take advantage of. Not even one I want to marry. I want to do something good for this person. So what does he do? Well, he looks at where she's at in her life. And he notices she's here to gather food. So he goes over and he nudges one of his workers and he tells him, not, what's her phone number? Not, do you think I got a chance with her? No, he says, what can I do to bless this person? And he says, when you're gathering wheat, I want you to accidentally drop some of the good wheat and just leave it conveniently for her to find. Now, the guy listening to this knows what's going on, but he's also probably wondering, why don't you just go and talk to her? He's like, no. Just bless her. And so he lays this wheat out for her. She comes for wheat, so Boaz is like, let me kick some off here and leave it for you. And this is notably something that she catches up on. She finds it. And Boaz then comes up to her after providing the blessing and explains his intentions. He says, you know what? Would you like to stay for dinner? You know, this wheat's going to be heavy. Mind if we prepare it for you? She's still here for food. So he's like, would you like to stay for dinner? And she's like, sure. So she stays for dinner, and Boaz sends her home with essentially her own cart full of wheat. And he's saying, oh, you're living with your mother-in-law. What can I do to bless your family? Anything. I'll be happy to demonstrate the heart of God any way I can to you. Real romance. Note this behavior. So she comes home with just this obscene pile of wheat. And, well, Mary, formerly Naomi, now she's bitter, but she's just like, where have you been shopping today? Where'd you find all this food? And Ruth essentially explains what happened. She's like, yeah, this guy left it for me, invited me to dinner. He's a really cute guy. And Ruth's like, or Naomi's like, why didn't you bring him home with you? Obviously, there's something going on here. Well, Ruth says, well, this is the guy. His name's Boaz. And Mary's eyes just light up, and she's like, Boaz? That guy is a relative to our family. Now, no, not a direct relative, but someone who's in the same tribe, who's of the same descendancy, who would be able to legally practice what was called the law of the Levirate. Now, you can look this up in Deuteronomy chapter 25, verses 5 through 6, but this is essentially what's going on here. Why Naomi's eyes are getting big in all of this. Not just because that's one of our distant cousins, but this is what's interesting about it. The Levirate law was as follows. Because the preservation of your family holding the farmland that God gave you in his nation was the most important thing in that culture, if a brother or any family member whatsoever dies, then it is your responsibility to marry your brother's wife. One of his brothers would marry the girl that his brother had married. And then they would take over the responsibility of having children for their brother so that they would be able to continue the family line. Now, what was interesting about this as well was the only way that you would be able to refuse this, and you had the option, was you were to essentially do the cultural equivalent of flipping them off and then have the girl spit in your face. And they would do this not by gesturing the middle finger, but they would take off the shoe and show them the bottom of it, because that's what came in contact with every unfortunate thing your feet were trying to avoid. That's just the most repulsive thing you can do to somebody, is to show them the bottom of your foot. So God just said, look, if your brother dies, it's your responsibility to preserve the family. But if you don't want to marry your brother's wife, say you were warning him about it, and then he still went through with it, and now he dies, and you're like, oh no, I got to marry that. Well, you would have the opportunity to express exactly how you felt towards her, and then God would say, well, you don't have to do it. But Ruth and Boaz was a member of Elimelech's family, and Ruth is one of his family members' husband or wives. I was looking for the word there. So what does he have the opportunity to do here? He already technically can marry Ruth on the spot, or could he? Well, that's where we get into conflict here. Ruth returns to Boaz, and she tells him about this. And you could imagine Boaz is like, all right, well, this is amazing. This is wonderful. When's the ceremony? However, he also understood, wait, but the reason why you think this marriage is going to work is because the Levirate law, look, we have to do this God's way here. There's someone else who's a closer relative to you, who's closer in your family than I am to Elimelech. So if anyone's going to marry one of his son's wives, it's going to be him legally. But he says, don't worry, I got this. Let me talk it over with him. I'll explain exactly what's going. So they meet in the gate of the city. That was the public forum of that day. And Elimelech's relative hears, hey, our cousin died recently, him and his two sons. All their land is open for grabs if you're willing to inherit it. And he's like, oh, great, more money for the crops. That sounds great. And Boaz says, oh, but I just got to let you know, the boys, they married Moabite women. Moabite, you remember that? I was like, oh yeah, I don't want anything to do with them. Yeah, so I mean, you'll get the land, but do you really want to tarnish your reputation like that? Do you really want to marry these Moabite girls? I mean, yeah, they're lookers, but what are people going to say about you? And he's like, yeah, you make a really good point, Boaz. Well, I'm convinced. So he takes off his shoe, he lets Ruth spit in his face, and Boaz is now given the ceremonial right to marry Ruth. So, oh my goodness, this is romantic. But also note what's really, really interesting about this. And I know I'm no fan of romance. I have about as much emotional tact. Well, I guess if I watch good enough anime, maybe I will. But I have about as much emotional tact as a rock. So what's making me smile about this is this. Moabites were not allowed to marry the people of Israel. However, there was a loophole here. The Levirate marriage allowed another law to take effect, so that Ruth, though she was not to marry the people of Israel, was there an act of disobedience there? Yes, but what did God set up? He allowed Ruth to be redeemed to his family, that regardless of the sins previously committed, the act of restoration, because of a law that God set in place before Moab had ever sinned, would ultimately see Ruth becoming a part of not just the people of God again, but the literal family that would bring Jesus Christ into this world. Look up Matthew's genealogy. Matthew chapter 1, we're given the family history of Jesus Christ, and Ruth is mentioned by name. So catch this. The kinsman redeemer law was that if someone owed a debt, this is another law aside from the Levirate vow, if someone owed a debt that they couldn't pay, a family member could pay it for them in order to keep their family member out of slavery that would ultimately, and by the way, back then, oh, got something in my eye here. Or I'll just play pirate here for a second. What was I talking about? Right, the kinsman redeemer. Curse you, dust follicle. The law of the kinsman redeemer was ultimately what would keep people from slavery. Now, when we think of slavery today, we think forced kidnapping, forced labor, work yourself to death, that whole kind of deal. No, that's Islam. Slavery in the 10th century BC, and note, specifically in the nation of Israel, they were the ones who set these grounds. God said, no one is to be a slave and to be abused. If you leave a permanent mark on them, then you have not only are going to be charged for attacking a human being, but you're also going to lose the right to have them as a slave. So you were to treat them well. No slave would work for more than 6 years, because every 7th year all debts would be forgiven. And no one would enter slavery unless they owed a debt they couldn't pay. So if you look at slavery in the context of Scripture, it would be the equivalent of basically in Pee Wee Herman, when he forgot his wallet and couldn't pay for his dinner, he was required to wash dishes in the back until he worked it off. That's slavery. Now, someone who would get them out of this debt, they couldn't pay it for themselves. But catch this. Boaz was not only the fulfiller of the Levirate law, but also on technicality was the kinsman redeemer for Ruth. Why? Ruth didn't owe anyone any money. That is true, but she owed God based on not what she did, but where she was born. A great deal. Catch a similarity to you and me? We're born in sin. We're born under bondage and slavery to sin and death. 2 Corinthians 5 and verse 21 says, he who knew no sin became sin, that we might become the righteousness of God in him. What happened with Ruth? Ruth was a Moabitess, cursed from God under no fault of her own, but guess what? God set up laws in order to be able to draw the cursed back to a relationship with him. Do you see the cross in this? The kinsman redeemer, the Levirate law, we're seeing the Messiah's not only family being set up, but also his actions being set up as well. And that's why these things were recorded for us. Now, catch this as well. When we're talking about all the events that took place in this book, there's probably another question that comes up. Why did bad things happen to this godly family? When they went to Moab, did all the men die and Naomi left to suffer in bitterness because it was somehow her idea and God was judging her, and it was like an Adam and Eve type scenario where the one most responsible held the harshest penalty of just living with it, and the others were taken out because they rejected God's law? We're not told one word about that. And the best thing to do is to not read into the scripture what obviously isn't there. That does not at all reflect the heart of God. And when we're talking about this as well, we have to wonder, why does bad things like this happen? I mean, sure, it all worked out, but why did this have to happen? I mean, granted, we see in hindsight that these things were working out, but I don't think if you told Naomi, whose now name is bitterness, Mary, that she probably didn't feel about it that way. Why do bad things happen? What's the problem of evil? People would phrase it like this: if God is all powerful, he should be able to stop evil. If God is all good, he would want to stop evil. So either God isn't all powerful or he's not all good. But here's the problem: that dichotomy of saying that there is no God because of the existence of evil, you have to wonder, well, are you taking everything about God into consideration? Why just stop at two things? Why not include a third? Is God all wise? Indeed, he is. And do you think that he would be willing to allow evil if it ultimately accomplished a higher good? This is what they would call theodicies, that God's willing to put you through times of testing and trial to develop, introduce, or reinforce a character trait that would become vitally important much later on. David Wood, in his lecture on this, mentioned in The Lord of the Rings, Samwise the Brave didn't become that way unless he had actually gone on the journey that involved meeting the Entwives and all the bizarre encounters that he met at Amon Hen, and especially in his encounter with the giant spider Shelob. You don't become Samwise the Brave unless you have to go through some suffering. But what was interesting about all this as well was that we saw the same thing with Naomi. What ultimately she was brought through introduced Ruth into her life. Orpah, she made her own choices. Who knows how God could have used her if she stayed? We don't know because she didn't. But ultimately, we do know favors by attributing motive to God based on a limited amount of information. When we know that God is all good and we know God is all powerful, we can also know that God is all wise and will always keep his promise that all things will work together for good for those who love God and are called according to his purpose. That's the contingency. Because separation from God, you have to wonder, why do good things happen at all? Separation from the source of everything good? All bets are off. And yet, blessings still happen in this world. Why? Because God causes rain to fall on the just and the unjust. He is always good. But he also has to be all just. Another issue that's left out of that equation. He is also all merciful. And that dichotomy is the real dilemma we have to deal with, because either God can offer one or the other. He can't be perfectly just and merciful. He can't be just in giving you the ultimate penalty, but then all merciful by just sweeping it under the rug. One would be counteracted by the other. So what does he do? He offers one before the other. You have been given perfect mercy on the basis of the cross of Jesus Christ. He offers redemption. He offers a relationship with himself. He offers this loophole legally to allow you a just entrance into heaven, not on the basis of your goodness, but his. But if you reject that mercy, judgment will be met on your sins. It could either have been paid for on the cross of Jesus Christ, or it can be paid for by you. And that is ultimately the choice that you get to make. Choice between Orpah and Ruth: I would rather be willing to endure suffering in this world and ultimately go to heaven than rather let this miserable world be as close as I'll ever get to heaven's light and ultimately end up in hell. Because, let's be honest, we're not all good. We deserve separation from God. But he has shown us mercy by setting things up in a way where you and I have been able to restore our relationship with him through him on a legal basis, but that requires your choice. If you want to make that choice, understand all that is required of you is to know that Jesus was who he said he was, that is God incarnate, and that by his death on the cross, you have been forgiven. And he made a promise. He said, anyone who calls in the name of the Lord will be saved. And to those who come to him, he will by no means cast out. Thank you for your time and listening to this study. If you have sincere questions, ask them. If you'd like to encourage the ministry, do so. But most importantly, if you know someone who's a sucker for a good romance novel, perhaps has brought up the problem of evil, or just isn't familiar with the book of Ruth in ways that you think that they should be, please share this study with anyone you feel would be blessed by it. Thank you for your time and listening to this study. Remember that Jesus loves you, and remember, most of all, what he has done in history to prove that, and what he ultimately offers to you.